In September 2019, SmileDirectClub raised $1.35 billion in its initial public offering and listed on NASDAQ at an $8.9 billion valuation. 2.5 million patients were already in treatment. 4 years later, the company filed for bankruptcy. Patients mid-treatment were told shipments had stopped. Some were still being charged. The chief executive officer walked away. The investors who had priority on everything got paid first. The patients got an $81 settlement check. Every detail of how this happened was in the public filing before the initial public offering closed. Nobody read it. The pitch was simple, and it was genius. Orthodontic treatment in America costs between $3,000 and $8,000. It requires office visits, x-rays, a licensed orthodontist, and 18 months of your time. SmileDirectClub said we could do it for $1,850, delivered to your door, with a 3D scan at one of our Smile shops, and 0 dentist visits required. For millions of Americans who couldn't afford traditional braces, this wasn't just a product, it was the only option they would ever have. The company launched in 2014. By 2018, it had $423 million in revenue. By 2019, it was in CVS pharmacies. It had celebrity endorsements. The marketing was inescapable. The S-1 filing they submitted to the SEC told a very different story. In the financial statements on page 1, the first page any investor reads, the numbers told you exactly what you needed to know. Revenue was growing. Losses were growing faster. In 2017, the company lost $32.7 million. In 2018, that loss grew to $74.7 million. In just the first 6 months of 2019, before the IPO even closed, the company had already lost $52.9 million. They were losing money faster every single year, and they were spending more on marketing than on anything else. In the first half of 2019 alone, SmileDirectClub spent $209 million on marketing and selling expenses. Their total revenue in that same period was $373 million. Marketing and revenue were not in balance. More than half of every dollar they earned went straight back into convincing people to become customers. The filing said this on page 1, in a table, with dollar signs. Here is what that means. A company that spends 56 cents of every revenue dollar on acquiring customers cannot survive on the customers it already has. It needs the next customer to pay for the last one. That is not a business model. That is a structure that requires the money to never stop coming in. In 2023, the money stopped. But before we get to the collapse, there was a decision that made everything else inevitable. It is in the filing. SmileDirectClub built its entire operation around a payment product called SmilePay. Instead of paying $1,850 up front, patients could pay $250 down and $85 a month for 24 months. The effective annual interest rate on this arrangement was around 22%. The company disclosed in its risk factors on page 36 that it had contracted out the regulatory compliance for SmilePay to a third-party provider. It did not manage the compliance internally. It contracted it out. The filing warned investors directly. If that provider failed to maintain regulatory compliance, SmileDirectClub might not be able to collect on outstanding SmilePay accounts. And if regulatory requirements changed, the company's ability to collect unpaid balances could be significantly limited. They built an initial public offering of $1.35 billion on top of a payment product whose regulatory compliance they did not directly control. And they disclosed this in the risk factor section, which is the section nobody reads, because it is written in the language of legal obligation rather than investor enthusiasm. This is what the paper trail does. It tells you things that the press release does not. SmilePay was not just a financing option. It was the company's primary revenue mechanism. Most customers chose the payment plan. That meant most of SmileDirectClub's receivables, the money they were counting as revenue, were money patients had not paid yet and might never pay if the regulatory structure collapsed. The filing said this on page 36. The regulatory pressure was already building before the IPO closed. State dental boards across the U.S. had begun challenging SmileDirectClub's model. The core legal question was straightforward. Is diagnosing a patient's dental needs and prescribing an orthodontic treatment plan the practice of medicine? If yes, doing it remotely without a licensed professional physically examining the patient is illegal in most states. SmileDirectClub's answer was to hire teledentistry doctors, remote practitioners who reviewed 3D scans and technically signed off on treatment plans without meeting patients. The company disclosed in the filing that it relied on these arrangements and that regulatory changes to teledentistry rules could fundamentally threaten the business model. In 2021, the FTC opened an investigation. In 2022, the company settled with multiple states over deceptive advertising claims. In 2023, a class action lawsuit alleged that SmileDirectClub had caused permanent dental damage to patients, bite misalignment, gum damage, root resorption, because treatment was approved without the in-person examination that would have caught these risks. The company that promised to democratize orthodontic care had, in thousands of documented cases, provided orthodontic-adjacent treatment without the clinical safeguards that exist precisely to prevent the outcomes they were now being sued for. And through all of this, through every regulatory challenge, every state settlement, every class action, SmileDirectClub continued marketing. It continued enrolling new patients. It continued growing the SmilePay receivables book, because the structure required the money to never stop coming in. Then, on September 29, 2023, SmileDirectClub filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It did not arrange for ongoing patient care. It did not provide a path to treatment completion. It sent an email telling patients their shipments had stopped. Some patients were still being charged. The filing they submitted to the bankruptcy court listed over 400,000 creditors. The majority of them were the patients themselves. 400,000 people were listed as creditors in a bankruptcy they did not know was coming, for a treatment they did not finish. This is the playbook. Build a product around underserved demand. Price it below the established alternative. Finance the growth with investor capital and customer payment plans. Grow fast enough that the revenue figures look like a business, even when the loss figures say otherwise. Go public before the cracks are visible to anyone who is not reading the filing. SmileDirectClub is not unique. It is a template. Theranos ran this play. WeWork ran this play. The filing said the same things each time. Nobody read those either. That is what this channel is for. The template works because the filing is public, and nobody reads it. The financial statements are right there. The risk factors are right there. The executive compensation structure, which we are going to look at now, is right there on page 133. The information was always available. It was just never explained. Here is what the filing tells us about who was running this company and what they were paid. The named executive officers for 2018 were David Katzman, Chief Executive Officer, Stephen Katzman, Chief Operating Officer, and Susan Greenspan-Rammelt, General Counsel. Stephen Katzman and Susan Greenspan-Rammelt had disclosed base salaries of $300,000 each. David Katzman's compensation is not in the table. It is not missing. It is not redacted. The filing explains why it is absent on page 135 in one sentence. David Katzman provided his services through an entity called Camelot Venture Group. Camelot compensated him across multiple companies simultaneously. Therefore, the filing states there is, and this is the exact language, no discernible amount of compensation paid to Mr. D. Katzman for the discrete services he provided to SmileDirectClub. Read that again. The CEO of a company that raised $1.35 billion from public investors structured his compensation so that it could not be traced to the company he was running. This is legal. This is disclosed. And this is the kind of disclosure that is buried in the executive compensation section of a filing that most retail investors never open. The company also invoked its status as an emerging growth company, a designation under the Jobs Act, to claim reduced disclosure obligations on executive compensation. They told investors in advance, in the filing, that they would not be required to provide the same level of executive pay transparency as other public companies, and they would not be subject to shareholder advisory votes on executive compensation. They told you they did not have to tell you what the CEO was paid. They told you you could not vote on it. And they told you this in the document you were supposed to read before buying the stock. The information was always there. It was just never explained to anyone who did not already know where to look. That is why this channel exists. If you want the next filing explained before the next collapse, subscribe. Every paper trail is already open. We just follow it. Here is where we are today. SmileDirectClub has rebranded. The company that filed for Chapter 11 in September 2023 now operates under a new name, SmileSet. Same technology, new brand. The filings are public. 2.5 million patients were left mid-treatment. Some are still paying off SmilePay balances for aligners that were never shipped. The class action settlement averaged $81 per claimant. The CEO's compensation for the years he ran the company into bankruptcy? Still no discernible amount. That is in the public record. It has always been in the public record.